Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much for being here. My name is Penny Dakin and I'm the Chief Executive Officer at ARACY, and I'm delighted to have all of you here with us for the 2021 Fiona Stanley Forum. I want to start by extending my deepest gratitude to QUT for hosting us this afternoon. For a small not-for-profit like ARACY, their kindness making this venue available to us is certainly very, very much appreciated. QUT, alongside ARACY, acknowledges the Turrbal and Yugara as the First Nations owners of the lands where QUT stands. We pay respects to their elders, laws, customs, and creation spirits. We acknowledge that these lands have always been places of teaching, research, and learning. We acknowledge the important role that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples play within QUT and within the broader community. Before we go any further, I do have to say a few things about COVID. To ensure that we are consistent with COVID regulations, please, if you're feeling unwell, return home. If you have a cough, if you have a sore throat, fatigue or shortness of breath, please return home. And please maintain social distancing throughout the event. As I said earlier, I'm delighted to have you all here for the 2021 Fiona Stanley Forum, so named after world-renowned epidemiologist, our primary founder, and still great friend of ARACY, Professor Fiona Stanley, AC. Tonight we'll hear from three very eminent speakers, and we'll give you an opportunity to ask them some questions as well. But before that, let me make a few introductions. Our first speaker is Dr. Norman Swan, award-winning producer, broadcaster and investigative journalist. Norman joined the ABC in 1982 and has won multiple awards in his role as presenter of the Health Report. However, in 2020, Norman began hosting the ABC's CoronaCast podcast, which presents up-to-date information and answers viewers' questions around the coronavirus pandemic, bringing the information into a format that everyday people can understand, translational research at its very, very best. Dr. Swan is also widely known outside Australia. He has been the Australian correspondent for the American Medical Association, the British Medical Journal, and has consulted for the World Health Organization in Geneva. And very happily for me, Dr. Swan is also a member of the ARACY board. Welcome, Norman. Our second speaker will be Professor Serena Bartlett, a group leader in neuroscience and neuroplasticity at the Translational Research Institute and a research capacity building professor in the School of Clinical Sciences, Faculty Health here at QUT. Professor Bartlett was awarded the Laurie Austin Award for her contributions to neuroscience by the Australian Neuroscience Society in 2019. Professor Bartlett recently launched 3 books that give light and grow the awareness about the importance of brain health and the role of neuroscience, neuroplasticity, and how to make it actionable. She's the founder of the Thinking Minds podcast, and we're delighted at ARACY to have her as a founding partner of the Brain Builders Alliance. And finally, our last speaker, Michael Hogan. Michael is an adjunct professor and Paul Ramsay Foundation Fellow, also here at QUT. He's also the convener of the Thriving Queensland Kids Partnership. Michael is also the co-chair of ARACY's Great to 8 research project. He also is a member of the Centre for Policy Development's Early Childhood Development Council. Michael was appointed the Director General for the Communities, Child Safety and Disability Services Directorate here in Queensland in April 2014 and finished up in that role in February 2020. Just in time to avoid the pandemic, Michael. Michael has had extensive senior executive roles in government, both here and in New South Wales, and has recently co-facilitated stage 1 of the ANZOG Every Child Systems Leadership Initiative for Child and Youth Wellbeing. I think together our 3 speakers will provide an insight into what's happened over the last 12 months as it has impacted, as the impacts of COVID have been felt by children across the world, across Australia, and certainly here in Queensland. So without further ado, I'll let Dr. Swan kick us off.
Thanks, Penny. So thank you very much. So I'd like to also acknowledge country and certainly pay my respects to any Aboriginal people present, and certainly to elders who are past, present, but most important of all, emerging elders. And I think the most that we can do as non-Aboriginal people is get out of their way and let self-determination take its course without any barriers. So it's been an interesting year, hasn't it? I might just put a little bit of context around this, because I did a series on pandemics in 1990 for Channel 4 in the UK. I've always been interested in this area. And by the way, although I started the ABC in 1982, I was only 12 at the time. I noticed Andrew Lammy looking surprised, and thank you very much for looking surprised, Andrew. It's very nice. And in that series, we actually predicted future pandemics, because that was in the environment of a few years post the arrival of human immunodeficiency, the virus, and many people thought, well, this is the first new virus to hit humankind. Well, we knew then it wasn't the first, and we certainly knew it wasn't going to be the last. And that's certainly a pandemic. You don't have 33 to anywhere up to 40 million people affected, many millions dying without that being a pandemic. And the thing about pandemics, and when this one was kind of starting, I had this kind of dissociative feel about the world and things around it, because you kind of knew what was coming. And you just had to know a little bit about public health epidemiology, and I certainly knew a bit about pandemics from my previous experience. And I looked around me, and nobody seemed to know what was coming. I remember going out for dinner a couple of weeks before lockdown had to be inevitable, and people were just laughing and joking, and it was like 1939 Berlin. It was bizarre and a surreal experience. But I don't think, even thinking it through, we've just lived through something that's really extraordinary. And we're here to talk about youth and child well-being. One of the great things about ARACY, which I'm immensely proud of, is just how ARACY encompasses the whole spectrum of policy, analysis and research that affects this incredibly complicated but so important part of our future. And that's what pandemics are about. It kind of reprises the thing. So biology is the least of it. You think, well, ARACY is about pediatrics, which is what I trained in, and is what Jerv trained in. It's all about pediatrics and medicine and health. But that's the least of what we talk about in ARACY. And with pandemics, the biology is actually the least of it. Bats are throwing off viruses all the time. They're just cooking pots of viruses, and they exchange genetic material, and they're throwing it off. And they're probably throwing off pandemic viruses all the time. It's our behavior that makes a difference. And it's not just China. The 2009 pandemic started in Mexico. The 1918 pandemic almost certainly started in the United States. Hendra virus started here. Thank goodness that wasn't a pandemic virus at 60% mortality or even higher. So they always come from animals, but you need more than just a new organism arising from animals. The plague is a classic example of this, a bacterial infection, where almost certainly what needs to happen for a plague to take off is you need environmental disruption in Central Asia, where the plague germ lives quite happily in rodents. It gets a mutation partly because of that environmental disruption. And then in the 14th century, you had established trading routes, the Silk Roads, not the Silk Road, which took plague to Crimea, where there was a war on. And war features strongly in the history of pandemics. And it was the Mongols laying siege to the Genoese. And the Genoese fled, taking plague with them back to Genoa, which is it wasn't Venice, it was Genoa where quarantine started, where they held boats, once the had started, offshore for 40 days. And if you read, say, Daniel Defoe, his account of the year of plague, the Journal of the Plague Year, it reads like COVID-19. We were transported back to the 16th, 17th century last year, because we had no vaccines, no treatment, and we were thrust on our own devices. And it requires human behavior. It requires society. We would not have had this pandemic had we not had weak authoritarian leaders in power, fragile authoritarian leaders, Xi, Putin, Duterte, Bolsonaro, and of course Trump. We had unprecedented lack of international cooperation and transparency. It's quite likely that if this had happened during the Obama years, we would not have had a pandemic because we had much more international cooperation. So you've got all these factors, and of course with any pandemic, disadvantage plays out. The poor come off worst, and that has happened time and time again throughout various countries in this pandemic, and the most vulnerable are affected. And it hasn't finished yet, even with the vaccines coming on board. There's going to be a third or fourth wave in the United States, in certain southern states. Europe is already seeing the beginning of a third wave. You're getting reversals in places like Germany and Italy. And this is not over yet. And so you might think this is a little, what I'm about to talk about is a retrospective look. No, it's not a retrospective look. We've known what controls this virus from the beginning. The only thing that controls it is social distancing, lockdown, and stopping people spreading it to each other. That's the only thing that works. And we're lucky that we have states and territories in Australia which led the debate and forced the federal government to act. The federal government did not want to act. They were getting advice from conservative economists who said it was going to be doom, gloom and disaster, who did not look at the evidence from the 1918 pandemic that cities which locked down faster recovered faster and it was better for the economy. And of course we see the truth of that now, where we have not got a devastated economy, whereas countries in Europe and the United States, where they've just only done half-hearted measures, never really properly done it, resisted mask wearing, have not been able to come out of a disaster in months. And of course, it puts enormous pressure on families, on parents, and on children, and the most vulnerable. And the most vulnerable in our community are children, and particularly in certain groups, but right across the board. Now, all I can talk about is anecdote, but if I was to think about the last year, what's had the most impact on me is, in fact, the impact on children. So I can't quote you chapter and verse, but certainly the impact of homeschooling, of parents anxious that they're, anxious on all counts, stressing relationships, deciding, it's hard enough in a family to get equal distribution of household duties, much less homeschooling. So, bedding, what's the bedding here? Who was doing the homeschooling? There weren't very many blokes or fathers doing it. It was women, it was mothers doing it, who had often other jobs to do as well. They're not trained teachers. That stress that was putting on families was enormous. We had to shut schools, not because kids were high spreaders, but because it took millions of daily journeys off the roads and stopped circulation. You can't get lockdown with schools open. And so one element of pressure, but there was also existential angst, which I actually hadn't fully appreciated. And we decided at a whim that we would start connecting with kids using CoronaCast and other media a bit more than we did. And so we started taking questions from kids, and some of them really knocked you flat. And the story that really knocked me for six was actually doing talkback in Victoria, and it was kids only phoning in. And we got this call, and I was kind of on the front line, and I said, "Hi, who's this?" "Oh, my name's Huck." "How old are you, Huck?" "I'm 9 years old." "What do you want to ask, Huck?" "Is my family going to die?" And then, of course, everyone in this room, and certainly for me, the world kind of stops, and this child has to be the only person in the room for you, not that wasn't physically in the room. So then you talk to this child about what's going on, and tell me about your family. I've got a big sister, and your mum and dad are at home. Yeah. You got grandma and grandpa. Yeah, I've got grandparents. and got through it. And then you were able to say to the child, your parents aren't going to die. You couldn't there was no equivocation about that. They're not going to die, nor is your sister. They're going to be okay because they're young and fit and they'll be fine. And subsequently, by the way, that family's got in touch with me. They live in Gippsland. And the family was actually going through a fair bit of disruption at the time themselves. And it was reflected in this child's extreme distress. And when we got questions in from kids, there were a lot of questions like that. And I heard stories of 4-year-olds listening to the podcast. I heard parents getting in touch saying they'd found their child upstairs in the bedroom listening to the podcast, 5 or 6 years old, and getting very distressed. So it's like, having to actually monitor. Who thought you'd actually have to monitor an audio broadcast that kids were actually listening, and I found that extraordinary. And these were kids in all sorts of suburbs. And what we realized was, and I think parents started to realize it too, is that there was just this enormous level of psychological distress amongst kids, that they were living with themselves and not expressing. And this is anecdotal, but that certainly with this child and with some of the others, when the parents found the child listening to the Chronocast upstairs and being really upset and in tears, this was stuff that wasn't actually coming out spontaneously. It was, these kids were internalizing it. I assume that they didn't want to upset their parents, and they were living in this fantasy world, not fantasy world, but of horrific ideas of what might happen. So I think this has had a profound effect on children. I don't have the data to support that, but there's just, what's interesting about broadcasting is that we are all committed to the idea that we're all individuals and we respond differently. Bullshit. We respond as a single organism. I'll give you one example. It sounds as if it's self-serving, but it is an example. Well, first of all, when I used to run Radio National back in the early 90s, Melbourne as a city responded as a single organism. It was extraordinary. The emails and the mail, it was mostly mail in those days, and the phone calls were all the same. They hated Richard Eklund on Radio National Breakfast. He was just this poncy New South Wales guy and, too sophisticated for his own boots. But they all said the same thing, no matter where they were writing from in Melbourne. And it's the same with Chronocast. People want to go down the street, people come up to me, they actually recognize me, which is uncomfortable because that's why I was in radio, so people wouldn't. And they all say the same thing. And it's the same script. Thank you. What for? What have I done? And there's some sense that you were kind of providing them some succor or information, they were able to make the decision. But it's the same response. And I only tell you that story is that I think if we've got this signal from these children, it probably reflects under the surface a much broader and more consistent approach or reaction to the pandemic. And then what we did was I had this idea of whether we could get these kids to express themselves through art. And what we did through the Art Gallery of New South Wales was I didn't want to have a competition, I wanted to have an exhibition. And so through the Art Gallery of New South Wales, I got a lot of experience through the young Archibalds, the young Archies. There were a lot of experience of curating kids' art. We had 2 kids' arts exhibition called Together in Arts Kids, and we had professional curators curating the exhibition. And if you look at this artwork, sophisticated, and there were young kids, this was the middle years, as we like to say in ARACY, particularly the middle years, sophisticated, very deep pieces of work, which show both optimism and distress and just a bit of fun. And really, and again, reflecting that there was a common response. So I think that what we've learned through COVID is that it's what every single person in this room knows, and it's certainly what we live and breathe by in ARACY, which is there are so many factors at work. Society, the way we live, the way we bring up kids, is influenced by so many different factors working together. And this pandemic has illustrated that in spades. And I think the opportunity for us as policymakers and as researchers, as politicians, is to actually capture the moment. And the moment is unprecedented trust in government. I mean, you heard me slanging off the federal government. They hate me. But the reality is unprecedented trust. Governments have done a great job. Just look around. It's a great job. And leaders have now got this trust. And we've got a moment, I think, for leaders to actually segue into other policy areas and exert that and pull that trust for an evidence-based approach to policy making. Because I think that they've seen what can be done. They've seen that it reinforces their political position by fessing up and saying things aren't perfect and telling the truth and being transparent. Their popularity goes up. McGowan's going to win, unless something happens that we don't understand, he's going to win by a landslide. Queensland, Morrison, who was considered unelectable a very short time ago, will win the next election. And so this trust has been enormous. And we as a community of advocates for children, which is a very complex area to advocate for, need to capitalize on this pandemic to actually use that leadership for something else other than the pandemic. Thank you very much.
I think I'll have to stand up because I'm not used to talking and sitting down. It's my Italian side, sorry. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for all the hard work you do to try and make our society better. I really appreciate that. So I'm Professor Selena Bartlett. I'm very proud to be a professor here at QUT. I run a research lab at the Translational Research Institute, and I've been studying the brain for 30 years. I started in Brisbane. Actually, I'm a Brisbane girl, but I travelled the world for a long time. I started because my sister had a mental illness, and she was in a straitjacket and an overdose of haloperidol at Wolston Park. And I was a pharmacist at the time at University of Queensland. I was doing an honours degree on why people buy cough and cold medications in a pharmacy. And I got a phone call, Selena, it's your sister, something's wrong. So my mother and I spent 3 weeks in and out of her lockup ward. It was very distressing, as you can imagine. And there was one moment, very, very clear moment that changed my life, and that is my sister sat there catatonic. And it was very clear to me, surrounded by tons of people, that we didn't know how the brain worked. Because if you knew what happened for her, it was a very extreme reaction, in my opinion, to what was going on. So for the next 25 years, I've been studying the brain. I stopped being a pharmacist. I did my PhD. And then I was trained by the top neuroscientists at the Australian National University in Canberra. I was very, very lucky. I was just saying to someone this morning, my research lab was Eccles' lab. He won a Nobel Prize. My lab was run by David Johnson, who discovered GABA, the major neurotransmitter in the brain. And then I ran out of tools. So I just thought if I just honed down more and more into how the brain worked, then with my pharmacist hat on, I just needed to find that drug. If only I knew what that was going to be. And so it comes around 1999, and I ran out of tools. So I then moved to San Francisco. The tools over there were much greater than I had the capacity for, and I ended up leading a big lab there for 12 years. And I actually worked with all the drug companies around the world, all sorts of things, and my lab was the lab that discovered Champix for alcohol addiction, and was very proud of that. Ended up on Good Morning America, Norman.
That was big time, big time.
Anyway, so while I was doing that, I'm telling you that story because the person that founded, so I basically trying to understand how the brain works. So my whole mission is to understand how the brain works. It's not to become famous, write lots of papers, and win lots of grants. Although that really matters, Patsy, my boss sitting here, my executive dean. It really matters, and I do that too. It really matters, because without that we can't fund our labs, can we, Patsy? Thank you. But at the same time, it's very important to understand how the whole systems work so that you know that you're on the right pathway. And I was doing really well, and I raised tons of money, and I still do that. But what I discovered in that journey, in around about 2008, I'd become very unhealthy, very unhappy and overweight too. I was raising our own family, talking about stress and trying to raise money, and I got really overweight. I was not managing my stress at all, and I didn't understand how my brain worked. And then the person set up a lab next to me who is trained by the godfather of neuroplasticity, who is Professor Michael Masinich, who we flew out here for the Future Thinking Conference, didn't we, Cheryl? My colleague here, Cheryl Batchelor, her and I have worked together in this space for at least 6 years in Brisbane now, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But the bottom line was I was walking around really as the director of medications development. And this person walked past me in the lab one day and said to me, "Do you really think that's going to solve everything?" And I said, "Yes." So she said, "Come up to my lab." So I did that, and these seeds got planted in my mind that took 3 years to change my own mindset about the potential of neuroscience education, but neuroplasticity and the plasticity of the adult brain. So we're talking about kids and children, but we all have the same plasticity. And I think until us as adults recognise we have a responsibility to ourselves to handle COVID in a way that can help the children, and I'm going to talk a lot about that, why COVID's amplified everything in terms of a mental health crisis in Australia, which is very lucky. Without understanding that, we can't change the conversation, and that's basically how I met with Michael Hogan through his organisation Thriving Queensland Kids Partnership, and also through ARACY, where they're trying to implement a National Brain Builders Alliance, because everyone deserves to know how their brain works. And that's the piece that's currently missing across all conversations, and I didn't realise that. I kind of realised that because I wasn't doing it for myself. And then understanding the dynamic organism and the potential of the brain for change is actually way greater than anyone realises. And the research in this space, advances in neuroscience through brain imaging technology, genomics, and the microbiome actually interacting with the brain is advanced at such a rapid rate now compared to 1999 when I had to leave to go to San Francisco just to get GFP into my brain so I could see the brain cells changing. So I'm here tonight to tell you that neuroscience has come to its fore because of the technology that's advanced so greatly at much greater speed than we even predicted 5 years ago. So there's a lot of things that people don't understand what they don't understand in terms of neuroscience. And so that's why you're hearing everywhere across education and youth justice and child safety and police, why you're hearing that word neuroscience. So the bit that's about to change, and we run a lot of programs now teaching people about neuroscience, but also teaching people about the capacity for handling the brain's ability to change by understanding why COVID or stress has impacted the way the brain works. So we now know very clearly that adverse childhood experiences over multiple generations completely impact the way our brain is wired, and it impacts our ability to think. We didn't know that before, and I don't have time tonight to go into all of the details, but to let you know that that's really clear and been replicated around the world. Each of us have an ACE score. It's between a score of 0 to 10, and it's done by a simple survey, and you can go online to learn about that. This really matters because ACE score, when we talk about kids in disadvantage, have very high ACE scores, meaning they're being impacted by a large number of adverse childhood experiences, and this affects their brain architecture. So why did everyone go a bit crazy with COVID, right? That's probably what you're asking. Why did COVID amplify all the mental health crises, problems that people already have? Someone might have a little one, but then it becomes a much greater one. So COVID has, as you mentioned, it's a once-in-a-lifetime event. It generates a lot of uncertainty, and the brain doesn't like uncertainty. So, for example, and it activates the parts of the brain that kind of manage stress and how we handle things. So there's really clear data just published from PLOS One that in terms of data on how young people are affected. So basically in Australia, a survey was conducted between the ages of, for kids, actually for all of us, about 3,000 people in Australia. And basically there was a 55 to 72% increase in mental health reporting, specifically in the ages of 19 to 25, and then getting a little bit worse. But each of us have been impacted from COVID itself. It's no wonder, is it? And in terms of like a personal story, during COVID, I knew this was going to happen because, as you know, that's what I do for a living. And then I had to change my own life when I recognised how bad things were. And I did that myself over 7 years after I left San Francisco. But in West End, which is where I live, I encountered the first time in my life someone trying to jump off a balcony during lockdown. And it was a young person. For example, I've never experienced that before in Brisbane, and I feel like Brisbane's one of the lucky places where it has been least impacted, basically. And fortunately, I was able to do something based on the things that I understand. But I just want to let you know that the data's there and published about a 55 to 72% increase in mental health reporting across the lifespan in the Australian population, for example. So why I'm here tonight is because this information and this education and our understanding of the brain is changing every day. And that understanding of the neuroscience about why we do what we do is really important. And brain imaging technology is the thing that we can use to show people the thing they can't see. So for us to make a change, what we've discovered is that we have to change the conversation from mental, or think about ways of doing that, from mental health and illness to brain health and fitness, because the brain's a dynamic organism that's really amazing and can be changed with effort and training and practice. But first of all, you need to know how it works. And we're working on that every day, and there's some simple things you can do to understand that. So I ask you just to put your hands up, for example. You know, let's have some fun. Come on, we're not going to make it all sad. We've got this amazing organisation here that are making a huge difference over a number of years. So, you know, the brain's beautiful, is what I'm saying. It's not all bad. It's actually the most beautiful organ I've ever seen, and I just absolutely love it. And what a great time to be a neuroscientist. And just to demonstrate the power that we have up here, if you don't mind, I'd like to do a little test with you. Is that all right? You know, I haven't had anything to drink yet either, so you'll be happy to know that. Okay, so this is called a working memory test, isn't it, Cheryl? So all I'm going to do is read out 8 numbers, and then I'm going to give you a math problem, and then you're going to give me the answer back. And then you're going to turn to your neighbour and the 8 numbers I give you, you're going to turn to your neighbour and say it in reverse. So really simple, everyone. We are the decision makers in our country, aren't we? So, okay, ready? 0, 4, 3, 1, 5, 2, 8, 9. 99 plus 4 is, say it out loud.
103.
Well done. Now, the 8 number, I want you to say that number, not the math problem, in reverse to your neighbour.
9. 1, 3, 2, 4, 0 or something.
1, 5, 8, 2.
What's the name of the new guy on the board? No, he's a lawyer.
Andrew.
Didn't need that anyway.
No, mate. Andrew, good to meet you. Likewise.
Right.
Thanks for joining us.
What's his second name? What's his second name?
Okay, everyone, because we're going to run out of time.
It's fine. I'm not going to use.
Who would like to? Thank you, everyone. I can see that we've now all activated, which is what our aim is. Okay, who would like to have a go at telling me what they think the number is? Just have a go. That's what we're all about. We're learning, changing. No problems here.
Yeah.
Go. Thank you.
9, 8, 2, 5, 3, 4.
Close. That was so close. You're one of the closest ever. Because normally we have to do a few more rounds so you get a prize. So what did I do that for? I just hacked your brain. Sorry about that. So when I said test, I stressed out your brain immediately. So I immediately activated the part of the brain that shuts down your prefrontal cortex, which is where you do thinking, and where impulse control sits, where short-term decision-making sits, and what we like to term executive function as a. But I want to say that we say emotions and all the things are soft skills. No, they're hard skills. It's a physical connection in the brain, and brains that have had extreme stress or trauma, as we like to say, we work across all these areas now, have an impacted physical part of the brain, which I would normally show you on a slide, that affects their ability to think, but most importantly, it affects their ability to say no to themselves. So what I did with that was to say the word test, math. Oh, I'm terrible with numbers. I can't do numbers. Why is she doing this on stage? We didn't get her to do that. You know, we're here to learn about, you know, COVID and brains in children. So, but I feel like if you don't understand your own brain under stress, then how can we expect us to understand what's going on inside the children that are coming from incredible bad backgrounds, and not bad backgrounds, but poverty and all sorts of things, you know, that affect their ability to think clearly. So when I did the working memory tests, there's 3 things that happened. You either you froze your brain down and shut down the blood flow to the prefrontal cortex, or actually you just want to run out of here and go to the bathroom and say, I'm just going to not show my friends what I don't know, or you just want to punch my lights out, which also happens. So you can see immediately how I could just, in 1 millisecond, activate the part of your brain that's activated in milliseconds that's really old. So, for example, if we don't understand this and working out how to mitigate the impact of stress on our brain from COVID, which is an amplifier, then I believe as a society, our role is to teach people also how to, as you're hearing about, is it time? Yeah, okay, sorry. As you're hearing about doom scrolling of all the numbers, equally we should be doom scrolling things we can do to protect ourselves from COVID and to help our children and our society. So I think neuroscience, neuroplasticity and this education is coming, and it's going to be a great thing for our society. And the National Brain Builders Alliance with Laurie in charge of that is really important as we try and educate people about neuroscience. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And so I'm Michael Hogan. Penny, thank you for your introduction. Can I also start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we gather and pay respects to elders past and present. I have the privilege in living and working on the lands of the Turrbal people here on the north of the Brisbane River and raising my family on their country. I also want to take the opportunity, because this is the first face-to-face gathering we've had of allies and colleagues for the Thriving Queensland Kids Partnership, to actually say a few thank yous. So if you will indulge me for a moment, please. I do want to firstly acknowledge and thank QUT colleagues who are here, the Vice-Chancellor, the Vice-President, and other colleagues at QUT who have embraced the proposition of the Thriving Queensland Kids Partnership and offered me the adjunct role and hosting my Paul Ramsay Foundation Fellowship. Can I also acknowledge and thank ARACY, Penny, you and your team and the board of ARACY. Welcome to Queensland. It's fantastic to have the ARACY board here. And thank you for the partnership with us leaning in and mobilising your members and subscribers in Queensland and backing us with this proposition around Thriving Kids. Can I also acknowledge Frank Tracy, the Chair of the Steering Committee for Thriving Kids, the CEO of Children's Health Queensland, and other members of the Steering Committee who are with us. Many folks in the room I've spoken to over the last 9 months or so, the CEOs of not-for-profit organisations, people from government agencies, from philanthropy, from the other universities. We've now got UQ and QUT, as well as QUT, Griffith, JCU and CQU as of last week, involved with Thriving Kids. An increasing number of organisations and professional networks and groups, and we're very grateful for the interest you're showing us. Can I also just introduce and acknowledge my 2 Thriving Queensland Kids team colleagues, Nicola Callard and Afrouz Shogi. Could you put your hands up, please? So please, if you haven't met Afrouz or Nicola before, please introduce yourselves. We are the Thriving Kids team. and it's fantastic to have two outstanding colleagues join us. And can I also just take the opportunity to thank any and all of you who've been involved over the last year or so, keeping us safe, keeping us well, keeping us informed, keeping us engaged. As Norman and Penny and Selena have commented, we've been extremely fortunate to have the level of political and public sector and corporate and philanthropic leadership that have got us navigated Australia through and mitigated the consequences, despite the harms and the enduring impacts that Norman and Selena have spoken about. How much better off are we to have been where we are? I do want to just give you a little bit of a background. Sorry, I'm not going to use the slides. About Thriving Kids, because this has arisen out of lots of conversations and lots of questions that I've had with you and many others across the state over the last 9 months or so. And really a starting proposition about, I guess, a concern about the challenges we have shifting disadvantage, the challenges we've had providing the life opportunities for too many Queensland kids that we want to provide for our own kids, or that we have been able to provide for our own kids. The fact that Australia ranks 32nd out of 38 in the last UNICEF report on the wellbeing of children. Despite our wealth, despite our well-being, that's not good enough, I guess, in our view, about what we can offer the kids of Australia. And so that caused us to think a lot about, well, why have we found it so difficult to shift the dial, to shift the trajectory and to provide the life opportunities sort of equitably? And so I want to thank everybody who's contributed to those conversations as we've tried to sort of tease out some of those questions. So how do we respond and recover and build resilience on the back of our COVID experience? And as Norman said, this is an unprecedented opportunity. We've got to deal with long-standing, pre-existing and enduring challenges around disadvantage and adversity and insecurity. How do we systematically listen and actually take action on the lived experience and the voices of children and families and young people and our practitioners, our folks who are in the field? How do we get greater coherence and congruence in and across our systems? For the ANZOG project, we've interviewed 90 or so leaders, the project team, across New Zealand and all of the jurisdictions in Australia. And, extremely, proud to see the extraordinary passion and commitment and skill and capability that we have in our systems leaders. But also to hear them speak of their own frustrations about their challenges of shifting the dial, of getting the systems to dance, to getting them to deliver the sort of results we want for kids. And so they've shared this extraordinary insight into the opportunities and the challenges of making change. The rubs and the disconnects between systems, how to deal with the fragmentation that we've created. We've got very complex, we've got very robust systems, but we've also created this incredible fragmentation and disconnects and rubs between systems. And you and your staff and our families experience that every day. How do we sort of bridge the gap between science to service? Many of you are involved in translation. Norman has made a life's work out of translating science into service and into public education. And yet in many of our areas we really struggle. The lag is too long. How do we bridge the gap between intent and strategy and execution and experience? We often see this challenge of not realising the intent of what governments and the public policy community are trying to do. How do we leverage the resources and the capabilities, the knowledge that we have across the philanthropic and the tertiary, the government, the not-for-profit and the corporate sectors? These are questions that we should be asking, and what Thriving Queensland Kids is posing. And so out of those sort of conversations has emerged a proposition around Thriving Kids. And that is, don't create another institution or another entity. We've got enough institutes, we've got enough initiatives, we've got enough capabilities and capacities across our agencies and across those sectors. but what you can do is actually broker and bridge and connect to catalyse and amplify the gold that we are either doing and we're not doing enough of, or that other people are doing that we need to adopt and adapt and deploy here. So we are looking at Thriving Kids as a systems work. We want to create a space, a platform, a playground, as Nicola described it, for systems leaders and influencers and systems workers to play and to learn, to lift up our horizons and our ambitions and our scope, and get people who are working in our systems. We are the system. This is within our control and our influence if we go about this in concerted ways. So we are interested in working with you on those initiatives that are integrative, that reduce the fragmentation, that provide the pathways for families and kids. We're interested in working with you on those initiatives that are enabling, that build human capabilities, the connections, the capacities, the agency that will enable people to navigate adversity and disadvantage. And as Selena said, one of the levers we're going to use is the neuroscience. And we're particularly enamoured of the experience in Alberta, the Alberta Family Wellness Initiative. Some of you will have heard about it, where for 10 years they've gone really hard with this focus on using the neuroscience and all of its connections to all of the other biological and psychological and social systems as a way to shift system capability and the capability of our workforces. So we are in a foundation year with Thriving Kids. We're building out the coalition of the willing, where we've now got a team. We're starting our co-design and action learning groups in sort of the 6 domains of systems change that we've identified: systems leadership, putting data and evidence to work, stronger workforces, smart investment, integrated delivery, and public and caregiver engagement. They're huge, they're big ambitions, but we do want to create a grand coalition around this public purpose of enabling Queensland kids to thrive. So I do want to ask you, if you haven't heard from us, please get in touch. If we have been in touch and you haven't heard back from us, please be patient, because we are really starting to get momentum this year. We are going to lay the foundations for a work plan for the next 3 to 5 years. We're going to take it carefully but ambitiously. We're being very mindful of the context that you are working in with COVID and the consequences of that. But we do want to lay the foundations for systems change. And thank you for your interest. Thank you for being here. And we really look forward to partnering with you as we take Thriving Kids forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. I'm really mindful that there are probably a lot of questions from the audience, and we have some nibbles and some drinks that are available for people. So in fact, actually what I think we might do is we might encourage you to be brave and to stretch your brains and to come up and speak to these speakers one-on-one as we enjoy some networking time, and pick their brains and try to understand a bit more the things that they've been talking to you about. I want to extend my thanks on top of Michael's. It's been delightful to be, this is my 3rd day in Queensland, it's been delightful to be here as part of Thriving Queensland Kids. We're so proud of the work that Michael's doing, and ARACY is delighted to be a part of it. So thank you, Michael, for that leadership, and thank you all for joining us this evening. And thank you to our panel of speakers.